A Discourse on Tradition and Liberty, Introducing Developments in the Western Tradition for and Against Liberty, Part 1. I recently read the work A Short History of the World in 50 Tyrants by Ben Ghazur. It is a generic historical work discussing various tyrants throughout history. On page 10 it is written, "When the tyrant speaks, it becomes the law. Tyranny is usually accompanied by repressive laws, harsh punishments, and cruel oppressions." He gives various examples such as Qin Shi Huang, Genghis Khan, Stalin, Mussolini, Hitler, Pol Pot, Saddam Hussein, etc. These tyrants have existed across the ages, continuing into modernity. This brings into question historical narratives surrounding liberty and tradition. Does tradition facilitate liberty, or does it go directly against it? There is a lot of nuance and complexity at play here. There is no denying that, in many cases, traditional values or teachings have been used to justify repression of liberty. However, it is important to know how these traditional values or various developments within these traditions facilitate liberty. Furthermore, tradition or certain traditional values may be useful to preserve and operationalize liberty in its proper context and manner, especially as the Enlightenment and liberal projects come increasingly more under assault. This essay will particularly focus on demonstrating how tradition, or developments within it, can be used to protect liberty of thought or conscience. Of course, there are plenty of works for or against tradition preserving liberty. Nevertheless, I will present a particular perspective on this, from which I hope my readers can benefit. The Western Tradition. To begin with, let us reference Dr. Carroll Quigley's excellent work, Tragedy and Hope. To summarize his perspective, the ideas of individualism and individual liberty stem from developments within the Western tradition. These are derived from various aspects of this tradition, such as certain Christian ideas. As an example, man is made in God's image. He also discusses both as the answer to fundamental conflicts that have played out in the Western tradition that led to subsequent developments, for example, the conflict between Protestantism and Catholicism. He also discusses pluralism and approximations to the truth as being concepts that have developed within this tradition. He hoped that our current age, defined by being a post-World War II one, would continue upon the patterns of inclusive diversity. Dr. Carroll Quigley lived at the beginning of this era, in particular during the post-World War II boom. However, it seems that this age of inclusive diversity in the West is soon coming to an end. In other words, for Dr. Carroll Quigley, the West is represented by its humanitarian aspects, not just its scientific and technological developments. Like has been said, these may have been developments derived from certain Christian teachings. For example, when we look at a Catholic work of theology, such as the Catechism of the Catholic Church by Jeffrey Chapman, we find on page 81, and I quote, "Being in the image of God, the human individual possesses the dignity of a person, who is not just something, but someone. He is capable of self-knowledge, of self-possession, and of freely giving himself and entering into communion with other persons." End quote. On page 384, it is further written, "By free will, he is capable of directing himself towards his true good. He finds his perfection in seeking and loving what is true and good. By virtue of his soul and his spiritual powers of intellect and will, man is endowed with freedom, an outstanding manifestation of the divine image. And furthermore, man, enticed by the evil one, abused his freedom at the very beginning of history. And in man, true freedom is an outstanding manifestation of the divine image." End quote. On page 388 it is written, "Man is rational and therefore like God. He is created with free will and is master over his acts. Human freedom is a force for growth and maturity in truth and goodness. It attains its perfection when directed towards God, our beatitude, the slavery of sin. Freedom makes man responsible for his acts to the extent that they are voluntary. Freedom is exercised in relationships between human beings. Natural right to be recognized as a free and responsible being, the right to the exercise of this freedom, is an inalienable and requirement of the dignity of the human person with the limits of the common good and public order. On page 390, talking in the context of the quote-unquote economy of salvation, he writes, economic, social, political, cultural conditions that are needed for a just exercise of freedom are too often disregarded or violated. Furthermore, he redeemed them from the sin that held them in bondage. For freedom, Christ has set us free. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom, and many more quotes such as this. For a more Protestant, perhaps liberal perspective, let us see William Barclay's The Plain Man Looks at the Apostles' Creed from Whitman's Leaves of Grass. Health, peace, salvation universal, is it a dream? He further writes that belief in universal restoration is no new belief and no modern heresy. It has always been deeply rooted in the thinking of the Church. He mentions that the first, perhaps greatest, exponent of this belief is Origen. Responding to the pagan Celsus, he neither denied the fire nor the torture, but he held that they were purification as well as punishment. He even went to the extent that rebellious angels, even Satan himself, will be saved, brought into willing submission to God. He further brings differing opinions on this, such as eternal punishment, conditional immortality, and universal restoration. No one is going to be dogmatic about this, so he says, but a father who can never be content when even a single child of his is outside the circle of his love. Of course, it may not be so simple as just that Christian or religious teachings lead to ideals of individual liberty. In fact, certain teachings may be used or may actively support ideals of authoritarianism or repression. The same may be said about other faiths such as Islam, Hinduism, Sikhism, Judaism, etc. Inquisitions, wars, conflicts, schisms, that history can't be downplayed. At the same time, we can understand how certain teachings or ideals further advanced conceptions of liberty. This may be understood as the dual nature argument advanced by Marxists such as Engels and neo-Marxists such as Madero. See the Napier Press published AQA Sociology textbooks 1 and 2. Or it may be understood in the terminology of Paul Johnson, who in his work Modern Times discusses the paradoxical nature of organized religion. In any case, it is important to understand how certain religious teachings can give rise to certain ideals promoting concepts of liberty. Others, of course, are more critical of religion as a tool to suppress the individual and repress individual liberty. We have thus seen the likes of the postmodernists such as Lyotard, who see religion as a meta-narrative amongst many meta-narratives, asserting claims to absolute truth. The father of postmodernism, Nietzsche, suggests truth will have no gods before it. The belief in truth begins with the doubt of all truths in which one has previously believed, in his book The Dawn of Day. And, quote, yet everything evolved, there are no eternal facts as there are no absolute truths. Accordingly, historical philosophizing is henceforth indispensable, and with it honesty of judgment, in his book Human All Too Human. Furthermore, we have those who talk of discourses such as Foucault and Butler. However, we fundamentally arrive at an issue with the postmodernist approach. We can of course point out the paradox at the very heart of postmodernism, that there is no objective truth, which itself is a claim to objective truth, hence invalidating itself. I have previously made a video trying to solve this paradox, where I have advocated a socio-hermeneutic approach, not an epistemological or philosophical one. I draw upon this idea from Rolf Peter Horstmann's introduction to the Cambridge texts in the History of Philosophy edition of Beyond Good and Evil, where he gives the explanation or solution to this paradox. Nevertheless, there is just another point to be raised here from this. The idea of discourses themselves is just another discourse, or whatever one may hope to replace our current discourses with will simply become the new discourse of another era. In other words, tradition will never truly go away, but may be replaced by one form of tradition or another. Furthermore, simply taking tradition to be the collective wisdom of a society accumulated over time, it fundamentally is an intellectual, spiritual, and cultural project that stems from the people. As such, it is an organic thing, a natural development, an aspect of human and social evolution. As such, we may assert that liberty as a concept or ideal stems from order, stems from tradition, from the principles underpinning these. As such, there is no meaning to operationalizing or maximizing liberty precisely in a context other than some kind of social or civilizational tradition. If anything, the ideals of individual liberty or individualism not operationalized properly can become a form of tyranny itself. This is where we may differ from the postmodernists. Whilst their kind of deconstructionist narrative has tremendous benefits, what they don't seem to acknowledge is that postmodernity signifies the subsequent return to tradition. As when you deconstruct a given reality, you will arrive at its core essence, perhaps not fully knowable or understandable to the mind or to man, but that objective reality is there. And hence, man has no choice but to reconstruct from the ground up. But whilst postmodernists may lament at this, we celebrate it, not as the return to dogmatism, superstition, or irrationality, but rather as a return to what is organic, what stems from people, and the certainty of man to act in this world in accordance with the transcendent, the ideal. Hence, liberty may only properly be operationalized in the context of a tradition, which places limits and bounds upon it, alongside securing its importance and status. Tradition must thus have inbuilt mechanisms to protect individualism and individual liberty. We thus have a choice in the times ahead, whether or not to reconstruct a tradition from the ashes, one that dignifies the individual and by extension the collective whole.